Thank you for coming to this press conference. If we don't succeed when it comes to the trade and investment agenda, we will not revive global growth. I think that's one of the main outcomes of this meeting. There will be no real recovery without a trade and investment recovery. We felt during more than 20 sessions that have been this week around trade and investments that there is very much support of the trade agenda. We also had ministers meeting to launch a coalition of trade ministers for climate. And the way we traditionally looked at trade, trade was about trade, but trade has also to be more inclusive. It has to also deal with climate and also other important issues. And that was also a strong signal here. Today, Dr. Ngozi and I co-hosted a lunch with trade ministers and key CEOs. The CEOs also came out with quite a strong statement saying that we, of course, will have to re-globalize and think differently, but we should not lose the baby with the bathwater, meaning that if we don't see a trade recovery, there will also not be the recovery that we want down the road. We also had good feedback on the work that the World Economic Forum doing on trade facilitation. This is coming out of the Bali meeting in 2013, but to facilitate trade between different countries and get rid of unnecessary red tape and etc. is super important. And there was also an announcement of further support on this work. So without further ado, I think Director General, Dr. Ngozi, you also had a meeting with the trade ministers, and I think they also agreed to step up. I think you also heard the strong support from the CEOs earlier today, calling for new momentum on trade, but also support of the multilateral work. So, Dr. Ngozi.
Well, thank you, Børge. I think you said it all. I just want to say that we're grateful to the World Economic Forum for the very strong trade track that we've had during these meetings, because I think it's needed. Just to add a couple more observations about what has been happening here on trade to what Børge said. One of just the repeat that there can be no real recovery without recovery in trade and investment leads me to the issue. One of the most popular issues discussed here was that of decoupling and fragmentation and deglobalization. And so meaning that trade is getting into trouble in the eyes of some people. We're deglobalizing, we're decoupling. And one of the messages we gave is my famous, I'll say it again, talk is cheap. But be careful what you say, because we've actually done work to show it will be very costly to the world to have this decoupling or fragmentation. If we want a real recovery with trade as an important component of it, which it has to be, then we cannot fragment or decouple. The costs, according to the simulations done by WTO economists, if we decouple just into 2 trading blocks, we will lose 5% in real GDP over the longer term. This is a massive loss, like losing the economy of Japan, and higher than what the OECD countries lost during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So we need to support the multilateral trading system. We need strategic cooperation alongside strategic competition. So we're not saying that the tensions are not there, but we also need to know when to cooperate. And trade, the biggest message that is coming out is trade is part of the solution to recovery, to climate, to the pandemic, and to all the problems of the global commons that we have. So I wanted to just add that. The second thing that has been exciting here is just this message on trade and climate, just how much it's been resonating, and the types of things that we could do through this Trade Ministers for Climate and through some of the work we're doing at the WTO. And finally, the Trade Facilitation and Investment Facilitation Agreement, which the Minister will speak about. I just want to say one thing. These agreements yield real savings in costs. You know, just in terms of the Investment Facilitation Agreement, when we get it done, the German Institute for Development and Sustainability has estimated that it could generate global welfare gains between $250 to $1.1 trillion by getting it, with most of that accruing to middle-income and low-income countries. So these are real things that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's then go to you, Minister Sokrea. Happy to have you here, and maybe report back.
Okay, I'm very glad to have this chance to report the strong commitment by WTO member countries on this agenda. Probably nowadays what we hear most frequently is supply chain disruption happening all over the world. And that means globally investment is taking place in very new style and manner. That is why investment facilitation negotiation taking place in the WTO is drawing huge attention. And we are at the last stage to complete. 7 parts with 36 articles are prepared in the draft last December, and we are almost there to have consensus among WTO member countries. We are planning to complete the agreement by the first half of this year, but at the latest, probably by the end of this year. That is our plan for the negotiation. In today, informal ministerial meeting on this investment facilitation agreement, 27 members actually gathered together and showed very strong commitment and dedications, not just from the developed country, but also from developing country, about to complete this negotiation by the end of this year, and plus actually to outreach other non-participating WTO member countries. So far, 112 WTO member countries join in this endeavor, and we try to expand the scope of this coverage by inviting more members. Yesterday, I had a chance to join a Busting Business Barrier session, and there I could confirm the very strong request and demand by the business community on this agenda. Business community also needed to have this investment facilitation initiative. So this is a very important public-private partnership agenda, and I believe Davos is a perfect place to upgrade our commitment and momentum by mobilizing business community as well as the public sector. So we feel very strong that we had very high hope to make another progress in the WTO.
Thank you, Minister. Moving over to Mike Froman, President of the Strategic Growth at Mastercard and former USTR. You remember him as that probably also. So, Mike, what has been the important outcome seen from your point of view? Is there more momentum for trade, or do you see only nearshoring, friendshoring, and decoupling?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, being just a simple private sector person now. But
so let me speak very freely.
Let me start by commending the Director General and the WTO members for the progress that has been made over the last period of time in what is a really difficult trade environment. I think the WTO ministerial, the 12th ministerial produce some important outcomes, whether it was fishery subsidies or the statement on food security, the commitment to a reform agenda, all very important. I know how hard it is to reach fully multilateral agreements, and so I feel your pain, Dr. Ngozi.
Trade facilitation, he did it.
But I think it also points, and some of the other things that were mentioned, including by the minister, points to the progress that's also being made through what might be called open plurilateralism, and whether it's the joint study initiatives under the WTO's rubric on e-commerce and investment facilitation and MSMEs and domestic services, or some of the work that's being done on dispute settlement and the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement. These are steps that members have decided to take, coalitions of the willing, coalitions of the ambitious, to come together and try and maintain progress in rulemaking and enforcement in the global trading system, notwithstanding the other challenges. I think it does point very much to the fact that there is still work to be done to develop a political consensus among the WTO members, and particularly the major economies, as to what they're looking for out of the global trading system, what rules and norms they want to see developed and adhered to, and where they're willing to take action. And in that regard, I would hope, whether it's U.S., China, India, other major parties, could perhaps coalesce around some of the most important issues facing the global trading system, including digital trade. Here at Davos, this morning I was at a Gavi breakfast where we talked about the nexus of digitalization and health. The digital revolution and green energy has been a major subject matter here. I think the combination where so much of our economy is now focused on digital transformation, making sure that those issues are fully dealt with at the WTO as well, I think is an important thing. The last thing I would say is I think one of the most interesting observations coming out of this Davos has been where there has one could use either the word collision or the merger of the trade and the climate world. And on the positive side, of course, the meeting of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate and that group, very important development in that regard. There's been a lot of discussion here about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and tensions between the U.S. and other countries on that. I think one thing to keep an eye out for, of course, is also the border adjustment tax that the EU is considering, and some of the feedback that they are receiving from developing countries and others about the complexity of doing that and doing that well, so that it doesn't become an umbrella for further protectionist measures. Those issues, I think, are going to define much of what we see, both in terms of collaboration going forward or potential trade conflict. And I would urge all the countries and, of course, the WTO to embrace those issues and take them on, as they are beginning to do, to make sure that it's done in as coherent and as pro-liberalization and trade way as possible.
Thank you very much, Mike. I just also want to underline that during this week we made MOU, the World Economic Forum and the UAE, to accelerate trade tech solutions for global commerce. So a lot of small steps that adds to really bigger steps that has taken place. So it's open for the press. Questions? Gentleman here. Are you doing the press thing, Fawn, or? Yeah. So you're the boss there.
Yes, I guess. May I? Thank you. I'm Frederic Clodier from Swiss media L'Agfi. It's a question for you, Dr. Ngozi. You say the trade and investment is part of the solution, but when we see that the largest economy, the US, is sort of doing the exact opposite with the IRA, many protectionist measures being taken. What did you say to the U.S. representatives here in Davos, Secretary Walsh or Trade Representative Tai, on the spirit of this IRA clearly subsidizing national companies in the U.S. only?
Well, I'll say a word, and maybe Michael, you want to join in. No, even before Davos. So the first thing I want to note is that, look, the WTO is very supportive to members trying to implement measures to decarbonize and to get to net zero by 2050 or before. So we're strongly supportive of that. I think the issue is how. And when some members feel that perhaps the measures that have been put in place by others may not be, may be harmful to them or not according to WTO rules, what we've been encouraging them to do is to talk to each other. We don't want these trade frictions. We don't want people to bring cases to the panel. So what we said to the EU complained about it. South Korea, the minister is here. They had issues with it. So what we've said, so it's not just the US, there are also, not just the EU, there are also other members. What we've encouraged is have a dialogue with the US. Try to see whether you can solve it. Our dispute settlement system does provide for for members to talk to each other and to try to find ways to resolve issues. And I actually think that there's been too much recourse to the formal dispute settlement system. So what we said, we advise them to talk to each other, and they are doing that.
Yeah.
President Macron went to see President Biden. Valdis Dombrovskis has been talking to Catherine Tai, and I hope these kinds of measures will end with something being resolved.
They even met here in Davos, Catherine Tai and Dombrovskis on this.
Exactly.
The two other gentlemen want to add something?
Would you like to go first?
Minister, you're a big fan of IRA?
Well, as you know, I had to spend almost the half of last year to deal with this issue. But as Director General mentioned, the U.S. government was quite cooperative to rectify the problems. The politics is politics, we understand. So it was driven by huge political reason. But the government tried to rectify the problems. So we are solving the problems, although we understand it will take some time. But this is not the first situation. We have similar kind of situation in the whole WTO histories. During the past few decades, we haven't seen similar kind of situations, and U.S. Congress was very, very recalcitrant to change anything, even after losing the case in the WTO, when WTO appellate body was working very nicely. Now the governments try to find a solution to address the problem. So we are working closely, and that is what the EU is also trying to do with the U.S. government, I think.
Michael Froman.
Well, this builds on what I alluded to at the end of my comments, because I think it's these two worlds that are coming together. And I used to work on climate before I worked on trade in the Obama administration, so I see the two worlds. I think for many years, countries had been urging, including European countries, have been urging the United States to be more ambitious when it came to climate. The U.S. is unlikely to be able to be ambitious in the way that the Europeans would prefer, which would be to adopt certain regulations or a price on carbon that isn't currently politically possible in the United States. This is another form of ambition. And it's an interesting point, because on one hand we have the sanctity of WTO rules. On the other hand, we have both the existential threat and the urgency of climate change. Those are both important to the United States. They're both important to Europe. And here they're somewhat in tension, and how we resolve it. One can argue one may be more important than the other at this moment or not. And so I think that's the dialogue that Dr. Ngozi is really talking about. The countries do need to sit down with each other. And I think the same issues, of course, will come up on the border adjustment tax, which could be seen, if not properly structured, as protectionist as opposed to dealing with climate change. It just underscores how important it is for the countries to find a way to have dialogue bilaterally, plurilaterally, and ideally in the context of the WTO.
Thank you. Over here, Vince Chadwick with DevEx. Two questions for Dr. Ngozi. I understood that this press conference was actually intended to be a moment to announce the facilitation agreement having been reached following the meeting at lunchtime. So could you just perhaps be a bit clearer about why that's not being announced and what the final sticking points are, please? And the second point, going to Mr. Froman's point about the carbon adjustment tax on the EU side, You're on the record as being quite sceptical of that measure. I'm wondering if your scepticism is growing or decreasing as the EU is now, moving forward with this. Thank you.
Dr. Ngozi and then Froman.
Yeah, let me address the carbon border adjustment tax. I didn't know I was skeptical about it. What I did say...
I think that question was to Mike.
No, it was to Dr.
Okay.
It was to me.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
What I did say is that there are 70 fragmented taxing and pricing systems in the world, and that's just the case. Different countries adopting different carbon taxing or pricing measures, and that becomes very complicated for business. It becomes complicated for developing countries. They're complaining about it because it's difficult to deal with, especially for businesses in their countries. So what we're saying is that it would be most sensible if we could have a global carbon pricing framework or system. And that would make it easier for everyone if we could do that. So we are not very near that. The US will not, price carbon, but they will use regulations. And as an economist, you can benchmark their regulations against a pricing system and then know what it is they are really charging. So we are really advocating that if we have this global framework, everybody can benchmark against it. What do I mean? If you look at the Paris Agreement, if we are to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade, we could look at what will it take for low-income countries, what type of carbon price should they face? Low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. So we are working with the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank. All of us have come together to try to say, let's put a framework with some floor prices. If you're a low-income country, this is the kind of carbon price you should be facing if you're middle income and high income. At the WTO, we've even gone further. We're trying to finesse that. If you're a low-income country with low emissions, should you be paying the same price as a high-income country with emitting with higher emissions? So that's what we mean. We're trying to come up with this framework, international institutions working together, and then that will provide a framework against which countries can decide maybe this is a more sensible thing to use because it's global, or we can benchmark ourselves against it instead of everyone developing their own system. So that's what, when I say that, maybe it's because I say 70 fragmented systems is too difficult, and that's the truth. So we need to work hard. It may take time, but that's what we're working towards. Now, on the issue of, let me move to the next issue, and we'll actually ask the minister because it's a member-driven process. I thought we are going to talk about the substantial progress made in the Investment Facilitation Agreement and perhaps announce when it might be finished. So maybe there was some miscommunication, but over to you, Minister.
Very briefly, we have making progress compared to other agreements. For example, like a trade facilitation agreement, it takes more than 10 years to complete. But for investment facilitation agreement, after we have the first draft, within almost 2 years, we have almost at the last stage to have a compromise. So it is amazing speed of commitment and dedication by WTO member country to have some final outcomes. This actually indicates the need and the pressure of the whole member country to come up with some kind of tangible outcomes in this very, very disturbing the world economic order. So it was not, so we were very ambitious to complete this negotiation by the end of last year, but it has been delayed. It was a bit disappointing, but we are still making progress.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but just to be very, very simple. So I understand you want to talk about progress, but my question is about sticking points and what the final hicks are. And sorry, Dr. Ngozi, I understand you've sketched out there the global vision that you have on this carbon issue, but I was actually specifically asking what your take is on the EU's CBAM at the moment. That was the specific question on that. Thank you.
Okay, no, my take is this. I think until it's implemented, then that's when you're going to know what it is. And that's the plain truth. I think the issue is the implementation of the carbon border adjustment measures. Then we'll see how you measure the carbon content. These are very specific, practical issues. That's when we'll know whether it will work, how it works, whether it's fair, not fair. And that's the truth.
One country has a very strong commitment to pressure on the issue of movement of actually the person in relation to this investment issue. That seems to be too controversial for many member countries. But other than that, we have a pretty much kind of the consensus. So we will see how we can have a compromise.
Okay. I think we take one more question.
Yes, the question was for Minister Ahn. The EU clearly had talks with their U.S. counterparts about the IRA. Did you use this week's meetings to try to make progress on the IRA with meetings with Catherine Tai or other U.S. officials? And did you make progress in any parts of it?
Although we have the same kind of problem with the IRA, the way we address is very different. Because for Korea, we have a small domestic markets. So unlike the European Unions, we have to be able to establish our supply chain with many different countries. That is why lots of our companies are actually trying to go into the United States. And we do, as a government, we do not have any objection on that issue. EU actually raised a huge objection on that particular problems. So in our cases, we try to solve the problems to minimize the transition cost. So that way, we try to make some kind of compromise with the US government. Although we have the similar kind of problems, the way we try to solve the problem is very different from the European Union. So that is why we are in the slightly different situations.
Okay. Should we take one more question? And then we close.
Thank you. Hiro Nishimura from Japan's Nikkei. Director General, you mentioned the importance of the multilateral trade system. And I think multilateral trade system.
Yes.
And Mr. Froman, you just mentioned the coalition of the willings. And I'm wondering what your thinking is on the regional arrangements, such as the IPEF, which we know that contains no market access measures. So is this arrangement conducive to global trade, or is it something that would feel disruption or fragmentation?
Well, to be honest, I don't think so. I don't believe that these arrangements fuel fragmentation. I think it is okay. As you say, some of them are now more frameworks. They don't have market access being discussed in them. And I think that any instruments that can bring members together towards common principles, common goals, working together, that is okay. That is not contrary to the multilateral trading system. But even can buttress it. Some of the framework arrangements that members get into actually contain some provisions that are interesting and innovative. And from there, we can bring them back to the multilateral trading system. If you look at some of them, the agreements on gender, on labor, on inclusion, which we could look at and adopt. So we don't see them as contradictory, but buttressing.
Okay. Do you want to give a closing comment, or? Yeah,
well, let me say this. I think I want to close on the note of something that you said, Børge, on re-globalization and how the business community is also looking to be part of, is the solution, or public-private working together is part of the solution. We think that there are opportunities in the problems we are seeing now in the vulnerabilities of supply chains. It is true that concentration of manufacturing of certain products, of raw materials, it makes us vulnerable. We've seen that, and that we need to build resilience. And we are advocating from the WTO that the way we build resilience is to re-globalize. What do we mean by that? Let's use this as an opportunity to diversify supply chains to many more countries, to those areas which you might not think about, but where the business environment is also good. So in Latin America, you know, people often talk of Mexico, but there are other countries with conducive environments. Brazil is there, it's conducive. Colombia, I mean, you know, you name it, there are various other countries. African countries, you have countries, Morocco, Egypt, Senegal. Let's think of this in Bangladesh, Pakistan. So we're saying this could actually be an instrument to bring in those parts of the world that did not benefit from the first wave of globalization, and also kill two birds with one stone and become inclusive. So I want to end on that note, that let's see the opportunity in the problem we have now, and re-globalization is part of the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Short comment from you? Or?
I agree completely with Dr. Ngozi, as always. And, and I would just say to your earlier question, I think these kinds of creative solutions through open plurilateralism to help define high standards, deal with new issues, explore the issues that are affecting evolving economies, can contribute more broadly to the multilateral system over time, and can help strengthen global trade. And habits of cooperation are just good to have in whatever mechanisms they find themselves.
Minister?
Yeah, more than any other things, the World Economic Forum this time provides really excellent opportunity for us to lift up our momentum and the dedications. So we hope that we can make another progress in the WTO.
Thank you. I think what was said here, and that I also agree with, is those open plurilaterals and also mega regional agreements can later lead also to multilateral agreements based on the same. As long as it doesn't get into a total spaghetti bowl, I think those larger ones can pave the road for then larger multilaterals. That is always the preferable ones. I think we agree on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.